Oh, now it worked. Okay, we're not sideways anymore. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you're watching this on YouTube or wherever else. I guess it's still on Facebook after the fact. Um, because I just know that nobody watches this live, or a few people do. But this is going to be a very quick one because we just did a gem and mineral show in Ancaster near Toronto this past weekend, and none of the inventory is back yet. So none of the props I had in mind to show you some things about rings. Um, I'm not gonna. I'll describe them. You know, I'm pretty good at that, describing things in a way that that people can understand them. I hope. Anyway, that's my plan. But yes, thank you for joining us at the latest Sylvia Findings live stream presentation. This is episode, I don't know what it is, 90 something, I think. Uh, is it only that? I feel like it's more than that. Anyway, whatever it is. Um, Thanks for joining us. This topic, I had this idea of doing a little thing about jump rings because they're kind of like, you know, they're like the most important thing. You know, if you're buying chain and you're buying clasps or whatever, and you want to connect the chain to the end of the clasp, you need to use a jump ring. You know? And the question always comes up, you know, do I use a jump ring? Do I use a split ring? Um, you know, can I solder it? Do I have to solder it? Do I not solder it? Um, and you know, the answer to all of those questions is, well, it depends. You know, um, generally, uh, I find in most, you know, lobster clasps or those kind of things that don't have a ring already attached to them, the little opening in the end of the ring normally isn't big enough for a split ring to get through comfortably unless it's a very fine, you know, split ring. You know, in which case, you know, that's fine. Um, Split rings are, oh, let me just explain the difference, in case you don't know. Jump rings are just a loop, right? Just like a circle of metal. Oh, it's so cute. A circle of metal, um, you know, to connect from one thing to another, to jump something from one thing to another. That's hence the name jump ring. Um, a split ring is just like a jump ring that continues all the way around again. It's like a double, like a keychain ring. You know, like the thing where you have to, you know, get the key in there, and you need to go all the way around twice before it's loose on the ring. You know, a double ring. So the ends kind of come up and meet each other, right? Except that there's a whole other piece of wire in between, so you need to go through one all the way around and all the way. And yeah, those generally are ostensibly sturdier than a regular jump ring is, where it's just like a loop. But when you're talking about chains, especially finer chains, you know, boy, it's difficult to find split rings that you can get through those because it's got to go through twice, right? So the rings have to be pretty, the individual links of the chain have to be pretty wide for them to fit. You know, which is a problem. Generally, I don't, and this is just a personal thing, I found that it's not always necessarily advantageous to use a split ring when you're connecting chains to clasps, unless the loops in the clasp and the loops, the links in the chain are big enough that, you know, they don't hang weird. You know, like sometimes for an oval link you might get a split ring through, but it only sits through sideways, so that it's coming sideways out of the link instead of hanging straight off it. um, and generally, if the jump ring is big enough, the gauge of the wire that the jump ring is made out of, if it's big enough, um, you know, there's really no need. You know, I think like a jump ring that's 18 gauge or thicker, you know, if you're doing, you know, unless the chain is like way too fine, you know, then, you know, you have to use a thinner, you know, jump ring. But if it's 20 gauge, maybe 20 gauge, maybe a little bigger, 18 gauge for sure. If it's 18 gauge or bigger, there's no need to solder it. You can just put those together. If you close them correctly, which I'll talk about in a minute, if you close them correctly, that's like sturdy. You know, 9 times out of 10, because you're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain, right? Um, to quote a famous 1974 Genesis song. But if you know, you know, okay? Um, there's got to be some proggers out there. Anyway, my point is, if it's big, you know, if it's that big, 18 gauge or thing and stuff, you know, if you close them correctly, you don't have to worry about them opening up because you'll probably end up, if it gets pulled or yanked on or caught against something, chances are good the links in the chain will break before that jump ring will open up. People don't really want to give jump rings the credit they deserve, you know. The whole point of having a jump ring that's perfectly round is so that any stresses that are put on the jump ring are more evenly distributed along a longer length of the ring than just at a single point where they meet. Um, Now this segues beautifully into the thing I was going to talk about, or about how to open and close jump rings. And this is one of the things I wish I had my props, but I'm just going to show you this. This is no, right? You never want to take the ends of the jump ring and pull them open away from each other like that, because you're going to end up, if you pull the ends away from each other like this, you're going to end up with a kink somewhere here or there, something like that. And if you close them, no matter how good you close them, the hardness is not going to be the same along the entire length of the ring, because all of these jewelry metals, silver, gold, copper, nickel, brass, titanium, platinum, whatever, you know, they all have a crystalline structure and they all harden pretty much the same way. So if you hammer them or stress them or bend them or twist them or any of that stuff, the stress where the bends are happening, the crystalline structure begins to break down, and the gaps that were in there that gave the metal room to fold into each other to become more malleable will become less malleable, and then eventually it'll fail and break. I hope that made sense. That was really glossed over, the whole structural, what's the word I'm thinking of? The structural, whatever. So when you do this, you're going to get the hard spots in the ring, and eventually you know, all the stress every time it gets yanked or pulled on will form at that same place, and eventually it'll work hardening to the point where it just can't, you know, flex anymore. It'll stress and break. The way you want to open jump rings is by pulling the end sideways away. And I tried to draw it, and I just couldn't get a drawing that looked good. So I found one in this book. It's a pretty good drawing. You see that jump ring held in the side of those pliers and pulled up and down, right? So you're pulling the ends away from each other, you know, sideways. And you're not pulling the ends away, you know, the ends are not pulling away this way, but they're pulling this way. So if you look at it straight on, it still looks like it's closed, but when you look at it sideways, right, the two ends have pulled up, right? I hope that makes sense. When you open a jump, and that seems like, okay, great, what difference does it make how you open a jump ring? Well, when you open a jump ring this way, the way that it's described in this very, very knowledgeable book. Sorry, if you don't know, it's funny because this is my book. I actually wrote that about 20 years ago. Anyway, yay, you know, I had to do a plug here, right? It's out of print, so it's not like I'm going to make any money from you buying that if you do find it. But neither here nor there. My point is, if you open a jump ring that way, by twisting the sideways, so, you know, away from each other, the stress distributes more or less evenly in a spiral along the entire length of the ring, so it all hardens more or less evenly. You'll get less of that kink where you open the jump ring this way and you close it that way. You can get it pretty close, but you know, it's much easier to keep the jump ring round if it still looks round the entire time that you open and close it. Now, sorry, I'm using somebody else's phone and his mom just called. So I don't know if you saw that notification there. Probably not, but neither here nor there. My point is, with the jump rings, if you're going to be soldering them closed, then I don't care what you do with it. You can, destroy it, bend it, back, do whatever you want, because just the function of soldering it is going to anneal the metal anyway. Because when you're soldering a piece of metal, you heat the metal past the point of recrystallization. I've lost some people. I can already tell. Do I need to do that? Let me just explain this thing a little material science here. Um, Most of the jewelry metals that I talked about, silver, gold, nickel, copper, zinc, palladium, titanium, all those metals, and the alloys that are made from them, so brass or sterling or carat gold, whatever. Um, they have a crystalline structure, and when the metal is most soft, we'll just assume that we know how it get to that soft state. It's a little too much to explain. But when it's most soft, the crystalline structure are aligned in nice, tight, interlocked crystalline communities, and there's big gaps between these crystalline communities, so the metal can fold around into each other, and there's room for them to bend, so the metal feels very malleable. But the more you work with it by stretching the jump ring or pulling it open or hammering it or whatever you're doing to it, the metal, the crystalline communities break apart, and then the gaps in between them get filled in with these rogue, unaligned pieces of crystal, and there's less room for them to fold into each other, so the metal feels less malleable. And eventually you could work harden the metal to the point where there's no room for it to fold into each other anymore, so it'll just separate and break, right? So that's what you're doing when you take a spoon and you bend it back and forth until the point where it breaks. You're just work hardening it to the point where there's no room for the crystalline communities to fold into each other anymore. It's very basic, things. I'm sure there's material science out there are saying, but Mark, what about blah blah blah? This is a very basic explanation for what's happening. The nice thing about all these metals is if you heat them up past a certain temperature, they go through what's called recrystallization, where the crystalline communities realign themselves back into that nice tight communities, and the gaps form in between them again. That's when you're soldering the metals, you're heating them past that point, and the solder, when it melts and flows, becomes liquid, will flow into the gaps between these crystalline communities and join themselves as a single matrix, right? A single piece. That's why if you've heard a plumber say, well, where you solder the pipes together is stronger than where and that's true, because it's, instead of one piece of pipe, now it's two pieces of pipe with solder in between. It's effectively twice as thick there, right? Anyway, so silver soldering, gold soldering, all the jewelry soldering with the torch, you're heating the metals past that point of recrystallization, and you're soldering together, and that's great. My point is, if you start with a jump ring that is all bent up and work hardened and stressed to the point where if you try to bend it anymore it'll break, and you solder that to something or you solder it closed, it's going to be dead soft after you're done soldering, so it'll become soft again. Why that's important, I don't know. I guess my point was like, if you do bend it, and if you're planning on soldering, you don't have to worry so much about opening it the right way, and you can open and close them the wrong way. So that was the most important thing. How to open and close jump rings was the biggest thing I wanted to talk about. When you're connecting jump rings to chains, and from the chains or doing a jump from a chain to a clasp, little tiny fine chains, if you can get a jump ring through there and it's smaller than 20 gauge, so like 22, 24 gauge, if you need to use a thinner than 24 gauge jump ring to connect a chain to a thing, then probably other better ways, like soldering caps to the end of the chain, that would work better. And there was a video, I did a video of that, right? Soldering rings to chains, soldering things to chain. You can look it up. It's in the how-tos thing. But if it's big enough that you can put like a 20 gauge or 18 gauge jump ring through the chain, then I wouldn't bother soldering it. There's just no point. There's no reason. I mean, it's going to be strong, but the chain would probably break before the jump ring would. Now I know that there are going to be some jewelers who are like, oh, you must solder everything, because you never know. And yeah, okay. But for 95% of the situations that you run into, it's not necessary. So for the 5% situations, if you want to definitely, be, I guess, pro whatever that is in your mind, yeah, then go ahead and solder the rings closed. But just not absolutely necessary. And split rings, I only like using them if it's a big chain, or a chain that's big enough that the double ring doesn't become conspicuous, right? With smaller chains, I find it's really obvious that it's a split ring. And you almost always, I find with smaller chains, run into the situation where the link isn't wide enough to accept both passes of the ring, for the split ring, through the link in the chain. I hope that makes sense. Sorry I didn't have my props here, to demo that, but that's about it. Jump rings are, you're meant for jumping between something and something. Tons of findings you can buy for whatever it is, if it's chains or if it's leather cord or satin cord, or lots of findings that you could buy that connect, or that will close off the end of the cord, and the whole point of those is to end up with a loop on the end of that finding, right? So you have these findings that are like cord ends, right, that are just like a piece of metal, kind of square. I can't do it. That you put the cord in there and then you fold the ends over, and and then the cord is stuck inside there. Sometimes there's a little tooth on it to hold it in place, but the end result is that there's always a loop on the end, and somehow you need to connect that loop to a clasp, or if it's long enough, I guess just to the next one, right? And jump rings, that's what they're for connecting the jump rings. Or you could also, if you had enough of them, use jump rings to make chainmail. Right, that's basically what chainmail is. Although I guess historically, depending where you're landing on the historical timeline, a simple jump ring wouldn't be good enough, because a lot of times, and I've seen this close up at the Natural History Museum. It was a Natural History Museum somewhere in Manhattan. There's this big museum that has all kinds of medieval stuff, and there was a display with some 14th century armor, maybe 15th century. It was like really old stuff, actual chainmail armor. And the thing that blew me away is that the rings were, instead of just being a regular jump ring that ended right up against each other, they extended past each other about a third of a turn, and the two ends were hammered flat, a hole pierced, and a rivet put through them. So every ring was riveted. It was riveting. I think it's the point of that is that if you try to, shank somebody with an arrow or a spear, the rings won't just open up and fall apart, and you'll die. So, but I'm just thinking, first of all, how long does it take to assemble a suit like that? And if it took a year of somebody's life to make that, but I guess if you were rich enough to afford that kind of stuff, it's not like it's just for decoration. That's actual, life-saving equipment on the battlefield. How far we've come that we could just vaporize people in an instant instead of having to shank them with a spear. Oh boy, this is the kind of mood I'm in right now. I think that's it. I had more things planned, but again, none of my props are here, so I'm not able to show you some things. I showed you the most important things about how to use jump ring, the proper way to do it, opening and closing them, whether or not to solder them or not, split rings versus jump rings. Those are kind of the most important things. One thing about split rings, yes, they are ostensibly stronger than jump rings, but it's a relativity game, right? Like if it's really small and you're going to pull on it and the chain is hard enough that it's not going to break, the split ring can open up just as easily, or maybe not as easily, but just as well as a jump ring could. That's my final thing. So jump rings, 18 gauge or bigger, don't bother soldering them unless it's an aesthetic choice. You know, 20 gauge, situational, really. I think it depends on, you know, how heavy the pieces that you're dangling from it. Smaller than that, 22 gauge or smaller jump rings. Yeah, I think almost always you should solder those closed. You know, I can't think of many instances where a 24 gauge jump ring is going to be very helpful unless it's soldered closed. So that's my advice. In the meantime, I think I'm done. I will, didn't really have much else. Oh, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Pretty good for not having my things. God, I'm just trying to think how much longer would this have been if I actually had my props and I could describe everything in gory detail. Maybe it's better. I will see you next week, I think. Yeah, I think next week. We're not going anywhere. We don't have a show next week or anything. So,
Yes.
we do have a show next week?
Not this weekend, but next weekend. There's a Surrey show.
So not this weekend, but next weekend there's a
But
show in
coming,
Surrey. But we'll be here Wednesday, yeah, because
Yeah.
it's a local show. So
Yeah.
we probably won't pack everything up until Thursday. So yes, I will be here next Wednesday. Join me. I have to come up with another topic. I can do that. Don't worry. Plenty of stuff to talk about. In the meantime, take care of yourself. Take care of the planet. Take care of your mental health. And I will see you next time on the Sylvia Bindings live stream presentation thing. Okay.